Mr. Sledge, good to have you with us today, sir. And you're muted. You're on mute.
There we go. Now I'm not, I think.
Yes. Welcome.
Yeah. Welcome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me and having me. It's a real privilege to join you guys.
Absolutely. If I call you brother by mistake, don't take it personally. But
I don't think anyone. I don't think anyone takes it personally when you call such a kind thing. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, all Masons call each other brothers, so it's a habit when we're in chat here. So, or if you're a friend of Hulk Hogan's, call you brother too.
Right. Yeah. Also, yeah. Also, to be called brother by Hulk Hogan would be great too.
That's right. I wouldn't mind that. So Al can hear and see us. He just can't talk or go on video. So he'll chat if he has to say something. Oh, good to have you here. Brother Mark, nice to see you. If you want to unmute and go on camera for a sec so we can say hi. Mark's a member of my Scottish Rite.
And I have a presentation on Google Slides, so I don't know that I don't know if I can share my screen. I might need to be made co-host or something like that to share my screen, but I have a presentation on Google Slides too.
Okay, no, it's, as long as you can share it, we'll see when the time comes, we'll see. But yeah, I'll give you permission to share.
Great.
That'll be fine. Mark, can you unmute and say hello?
How's everybody doing?
Hey, nice to hear you anyway.
I'll be on for a little bit.
Okay.
I'm driving right now.
Oh, well then don't worry about the camera then.
It's on the dash. So.
Okay. Good to have you here.
I don't think y'all want to see me driving around.
Too many people, we do that when we ask people to, show themselves on camera so we can see who it is. It's always, I can't, well here, I can hear something like this. Hey, what's going on?
Right.
You're driving. Yes. Yeah, we do physical comedy here as well, yes. But yeah, then we tell them, yeah, go ahead and mute. We don't want to have you crash on our code. Well, good to have you here, Mark.
Yeah, good to be here.
Mark's a member of my local valley. You're, I forget, Atlantic? No.
Fentress.
No. Fentress, that's right.
I'm Fentress.
You're actually probably the closest to my house. Your lodge is anyway. But yeah.
Okay.
I've been trying to get more local guys, Brian, to come in. We have so many, we have more Brits than we have Virginians for some reason on this chat. I've tried to persuade more of my local fellows to join us on this. And for some reason, I don't know, we can't seem to get an audience. We have an audience, just not local people. It's kind of weird, but I'm rolling with it. So Justin, we're just gonna wait a few minutes. It's just after 1. And let a few more people join. I really don't know what to expect because this is not our normal time.
Right.
And I found out that since we just came off of daylight, we just came off, I think, daylight time. And England is not yet switched. So it's only 5 o'clock there instead of 6.
Mm-hmm.
So, we're not sure if people wish, and I guess this was the perfect time that we calculated to catch all of them at 6 o'clock. Which worked well for everyone. Hello, Ira. But unfortunately, it's 5, so we may not get as many as we hoped. But we'll wait. We'll give a few minutes, see if we can get at least. I want to at least have a few people here for your presentation. We will put it on YouTube, of course, but I like having a good audience so we can ask good questions and
sure,
hopefully be good. So, brother, Ira's wrestling with his setup there. Hello, Brother Knox. Nice to have you here. Brother Dreyfus, you want to unmute and say hello? Tell us where you're from.
I can do that.
Excellent.
Son of a gun, I can find the mute button. I am.
Good.
Stuff today. Mushalomka. I am from Reston, Virginia. And
okay.
I was down I am at the Patriot Lodge at George Mason University. Go Patriots.
Excellent.
And we think so too. And also Herndon Lodge, which is my mother lodge. And I was down in the Norfolk area just the other day. And it is a beautiful place to be, especially if you're getting your second COVID shot.
Excellent. You came all the way here just to get a COVID shot.
Well, my son, who's a brother Mason and lives in Indiana, set it up for me back in the days when those things were pretty rare.
Right.
And so he basically just squatted on various zip codes
Mhm.
until he got lucky and found one and said, "Are you willing to go to Norfolk?" And I said, "Yeah, I can do that." And so I will therefore live.
Okay. Very good.
Beats the alternative, I can tell you that.
I guess, yeah. Well, I admire your confidence in the vaccine.
Well, it's got a 95% efficacy rate, which is
That's right.
better than I have in ordinary life. So I figure I'm
Okay. Well, there
yeah.
you go. There you go.
Yeah.
Welcome, Brother Joyner. Another one of our frequent flyers. You want to unmute and say hello?
Hello, Worshipables. Good to be here.
Good to see you, sir. Brother Knox, if you want to do the same, unmute and say hello. Turn on your camera if you can, just to say hi.
Hello.
I am going to mute if it's okay with you guys,
Oh, by all
because
means.
I'm not the star of the show.
no.
Justin Sledge is, I
Yes.
take it. And so, yeah, there's not much more I can say except hello, Brother Justin.
We just wanted everyone to at least say hello when they come in, so we can validate they're not a bot, I guess. I don't know. I don't think we're gonna have any problems. We do have a few people that pop up and we ask them to unmute and say hello. You know, if they have like a number for their name or just one name, and half of them just seem to go away, don't they, brother? They just disappear. When they're challenged, they disappear. It's funny. So we're going to wait at least till 10 after before we start. Welcome to everybody here. My name is Chris Douglas. I am your genial host of Virginia Research Lodge's unstated meetings. And here is our unstated and unsaturday meeting today to accommodate Mr. Sledge, who's gracious enough to come here. And he'll be giving a talk on Jewish Alchemists. That's the working title. I don't know if you have a formal name for your presentation, but you'll be talking about alchemy and Jewish alchemists. So it should be quite interesting. We did have a brother who gave a talk on alchemy as it relates to the Master Mason's degree. He was on a few weeks ago. I invited him especially to come and attend since he might enjoy that and have some more to say. I have asked better questions than maybe we could, but I don't see him on here yet. I forget his name, but I'll remember it in a minute. I can check real quick. But yeah, he gave a talk on alchemy as it relates to the Master Mason's degree. His name was, let's see. Nope, not there. Okay. I'll have to look him up.
Worshipful Chris, you're too young to forget stuff. You leave that to the older folks like us.
It's my brain. I have too much crowding my brain all of the time is what it is. So but give me one sec and you can all talk amongst yourselves. Here's the topic. The Roman Empire was neither Roman, the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Discuss. That was coffee talk with Alan Richmond. Let's see. Anyway, let's see. I can keep vamping while I search Facebook. I really wish I could.
Brother Chris.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
And or Worshipful Chris.
Yes. Still worshipful as far as I know.
Okay. I was wondering about the possibilities, as I think I mentioned to you earlier, about getting together a group of Masons who would be able to go down and have some form of visitation with our brethren in Cuba.
Yes. I think that would be cool. As long as the Grand Lodge of Virginia recognizes the Grand Lodge of Cuba, that would be allowed.
Yeah, that's the one. That's one question.
Standpoint.
Yeah, I don't know if we do or we don't.
I can check into that.
Yeah,
Should be able to find that out. Yeah, that would be cool.
And I think that, there are, if we pursue this, about 1,000 million hoops to go through with the State Department.
Yeah.
But those hoops, if we do it through a group that does these things regularly, and there are organizations out there that, like Rhodes Scholar, which is the Geezer group, which puts together tours, then I suspect we could do it without doing too much more than saying who we want to visit, working it out with the Grand Lodge of Cuba, and paying our money, and they would take care of logistics. Logistics can be a bear in Cuba,
Right.
but if you go to the right place and know the right people,
Yeah, that sounds interesting. Yes.
yeah,
If I can help promote it, I'll certainly be happy to.
yeah.
Do that.
I visited briefly on, and I'm vamping too. I just want to point out.
I understand. No.
Okay, I visited briefly on a Rhodes Scholar tour of Cuba. This is about 4 or 5 years ago now, and desperately tried to get in to meet some of the brethren, and I finally did in Cienfuegos.
Okay.
Just before the bus left to carry us to the airport. Otherwise, I'd be living in Cuba to this day.
Ah.
But they were a fantastic group of men. And to say that Freemasonry is respected in Cuba and treated honorably among the people of Cuba, you know, the other citizens of Cuba, is to say the least. Everybody knows everybody who's a Mason. And yeah, and so and so I wandered into the lodge, which was a beautiful building, stone, and was able to visit quite a while until finally I had to run for the bus, or I would, as I say, have an apartment somewhere in Havana.
All right. That's interesting. Yeah, keep me posted on that. I'm definitely interested. Brother Rodney McGilvery was our speaker, and I did message him, and he said he was interested in attending, but I don't see him, so he'll have to catch it on YouTube. Brother Reed, would you like to unmute and turn on your camera at least and say hello?
Hi, folks. Sorry, my camera is not working.
That's quite all right. Where are you from, brother?
Westgate Lodge 738 in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Oh, okay. So you're a neighbor. Okay, I see it's 12 o'clock, or 12 after 1, rather, and I think we have what we're going to get is 10. Mr. Sledge, I do apologize. I was hoping for a bigger crowd, but I can promise you some will watch this on YouTube. So it's up to those of us who are here to come up with good questions. So I'll go ahead and give you the full. Let me do this. Figure out how to do the share screen thing. Oh, one per. I think anyone actually. Yeah, I think. Oh, all participants. Let's do that. Okay. Go ahead, Mr. Sledge.
All right.
You have the floor. I did have a video that the good brother Evans, I think his name was, who connected us. He gave me like a nice 4.5-minute video where he talked about Cornwall at great length and didn't mention you to the end, so I didn't want to bother with his presentation. So I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself if that's all right.
Yeah, that's totally fine.
Okay, and you have the floor, sir.
All right. Well, first of all, let me just say thank you so much for having me and for hosting this talk. I'm not a Freemason myself, but I have every encounter I've ever had with the Brothers of the Freemasons has just been incredible. You guys are a really fun organization, and I've just had such good interactions with Freemasons over and over and over again. So I really appreciate the invitation to be among you guys and to talk a little today about Jewish alchemy. So let me pop this up. So just a bit about me. I'm a professor of religion and philosophy. I primarily work in the field of Western esotericism. So my subspecialty, I suppose. And that would cover everything, including things like Kabbalah, magic, alchemy, witchcraft, the huge range of stuff that sort of covered Hermetic philosophy that will be covered by Western esotericism. And so obviously a lot of ideas that are looped into Freemasonry, right? So Rosicrucianism, other stuff that are sort of looped into that world. There's a lot of very strong overlaps in that world. And I'm also the host of a YouTube channel that I'll put in the chat, called Esoterica, where I have one of the few YouTube channels that is exclusively dedicated to presenting topics in Western esotericism from an academic perspective, from a scholarly perspective. So you may want to check out my YouTube channel, and we cover a wide range of things there. And so, and some of the episodes will be very deep dives into some of the stuff that I'll be covering a little more superficially today. For instance, Maria the Jewess, really early alchemist. I have an entire episode dedicated just to her. So you may want to check out my YouTube channel if you're interested in Hermeticism and things like that more generally. This week's episode was a pretty deep dive into the demonologists that wrote prior to the witch trials. So before the Malleus Maleficarum, the very famous witch hunting manual that was published there. But for today, what I'm going to be talking about is Jewish alchemy and alchemists. And Judaism has had a very long relationship, perhaps the longest relationship with alchemy, stretching all the way back to very remote antiquity. And one of the last alchemical texts ever published, where by an actual operating alchemist, was a Jewish alchemist on a small island off the coast of Tunisia in the 19th century. So in some sense, Judaism has had contact with alchemy going back basically about 2,000 years. So it is a very long relationship indeed. So to say a bit about Jewish alchemy, we need to say a little bit about what alchemy was or is. I guess it depends on if you're still practicing alchemy out there. Some people are, I think. But to say a little bit about what alchemy was. It was, in some sense, a theory and practice which attempted to transform nature and understand nature, right? It was a complete package of attempting to transform and understand nature. Typically, we think of alchemy as basically being composed of two different theoretical frameworks. The first was Aristotle's physical theory. You know, I'm sure many folks have some touch with Aristotle's ideas. That is to say, nature was composed of four fundamental simple bodies: earth, air, fire, and water, and that those were bound together with a fifth element, a quintessence. So literally the word quintessential means fifth essence. And that the basic idea was that all things were underneath the hood, so to speak, one fundamental substance. And if you were to decompose anything down into that one fundamental substance, you could recompose it as something else. And this is the idea of what is called substantial transmutation. We'll talk about that more in just a moment. Now, that was also mixed with a theory that began to develop in the Hellenistic period and through the Islamic period, where the basic idea was that the metals, the fundamental constituent parts of all metals, were sulfur and mercury. And that is to say, all metals were some combination of sulfur and mercury. And therefore, if you could decompose them back into their relationships of sulfur and mercury, you could reconstitute them, for instance, as something like gold or silver. You could also reconstitute them as lead, but no one was terribly interested in making gold and silver into lead for reasons that you can easily imagine. No one's going to be terrible. Most people would probably think you're a fool if you were converting gold into lead. It always goes the other way around, obviously. But alchemical theory allowed for both. Typically, alchemy had what we think of as three separate goals. I'm going to add a fourth goal in there too, but that fourth goal is added a bit later. But those three big goals are the creation of what is called a universal solvent. This is called the Alchemist. The universal solvent was always a bit of a bear because if it can dissolve anything, well, what do you store it in, right? That was always the big problem. And so this idea of something being hermetically sealed was the idea that basically it could contain anything, including the Alchemist. So this is, again, sort of a theoretical conundrum. Another thing that alchemists were very interested in was elixirs, right? Elixirs for the prolongation of life. While Chinese alchemy did attempt to produce elixirs that would allow you to live forever, typically because of the way that alchemy grew up, especially in the Judeo-Islamic Christian environment, you living forever is not in the cards, right? It just doesn't jive with the theology of Christianity. And the idea that you could live forever doesn't really work, but you could live for a very, very long time. And there are alchemists through history who claim to actually have been hundreds of years old, Nicolas Flamel, a pretty famous French alchemist. There's a gravestone that basically puts him at about 400 years old. And he claimed that he was 400 years old when he died. Now, why anyone in their right mind would want to live for 400 years is beyond me, but that was a thing that alchemists attempted to do. The next thing I'll mention is the creation of artificial life. I don't have it in my list here, but in later alchemy, the creation of what is called the homunculus, the creation of an artificial living creature, was also a goal of some alchemists, especially German alchemists, later toward the very end of alchemical history. And the idea of creating artificial life, of course, obviously links up with Judaism, the idea of the golem, the artificial humanoid. And those ideas are taken up into literature. For instance, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein really dovetails very, very much with the idea of creating artificial life. And lastly, of course, the thing that alchemy is perhaps most famous for is its attempt to transmute base metals into gold, So this would be something like lead and tin, converting that into what we call the noble metals. That would be things like silver and gold. Now, I will say that not every alchemist was interested in all of these things at once. Some of them were obviously just interested in trying to convert lead to gold for reasons that should be relatively obvious. But some were much more interested in the creation of the universal solvent. Robert Boyle, a really famous chemist, who basically is responsible for chemistry as we know it, and his book, The Skeptical Chemist, he was very interested in the creation of an artificial solvent. And artificial solvents were or rather universal solvents were being sought after well into the Islamic period. And of course, that's a period in which the acids, as we know them, were invented: sulfuric acid, hydrochloric acid, nitric acid. So those were invented in the attempt to find that universal solvent. Now, alchemy, as I'm sure all of you know, is very rich in its symbolism. It's very luscious in its use of allegory. It revels in very complicated imagery that is often very difficult to decipher. You have to basically work really hard at trying to even understand a lot of what these images mean in order to decrypt them in some sense. And this makes some sense, of course. Alchemists were people interested in maintaining their secrets. Basically, you can think of them as trade secrets. Part of what an alchemist needed to do was to communicate that they knew how to do various kinds of chemical transformations and publish about that. But obviously, they're not going to publish how they did it because, well, if they do that, then you can do it too. And so why hire that alchemist if you can do it yourself? You can see in this image that's on the screen currently the images, the symbols for sulfur here on the right and mercury there on the left. Again, this is that mercury sulfur theory, right? And we have here the images of gold and silver in the balance, right, and among the waters here in this hermetically sealed vessel. And so as they heat these up, right, the combination of mercury and silver give wings in some sense to the transformation of that base liquid into gold or silver. So again, decrypting these images can be quite difficult. In fact, it's only now really in the 20th century and in the 21st century that we have a really solid grasp of what a lot of these images even mean now. So at any rate, alchemy eventually gave way to chemistry. And in sort of the disenchantment that followed, mostly in the 19th and 20th centuries, what ended up happening was that a lot of European history kind of underwent a giant romanticization. So the Middle Ages got heavily romanticized. This is the time period where Wagner is really romanticizing the ancient Germanic history. And alchemy also was heavily romanticized beginning in the 19th and 20th centuries as well. Well, this is also happening at a time period where many people looking at alchemical manuscripts have basically no idea what they mean. And so rather than do the hard work of trying to decipher them, which is still going on, they simply said this alchemy stuff had nothing to do with people trying to transform things into metal or transform things into gold. Rather, it had to do with esoteric spiritual practices. And so there's a lot of ideas that alchemy had nothing to do with laboratories and had everything to do with the transformation of one's soul or the transformation of one's character or one's spirit, or in the other case of Carl Jung, the psychologist, psychoanalyst. For him, it was a transmutation of one's psyche. And so he developed an entire psychoanalytic interpretation of what alchemy was. I think that the Jung stuff and other folks like Mary Ann Atwood, who was also one of the people who spiritualized alchemy in the late 19th century, while I think that stuff is incredibly interesting, it doesn't really grasp alchemy in its historical circumstances. It doesn't really understand alchemy as a laboratory science. And so we can talk more about that, but alchemy certainly was an experimental science in a very, very robust sense. And as I say here at the very bottom of the slide, it wasn't until really the late 20th and early 21st century where we have people who study alchemy from an artistic point of view, laboratory chemists, scholars of Western Hermeticism, forensic scholars who actually studied some of the remains of some of these alchemical laboratories. It's only really now in the past 20 years that we actually have a glimpse into what the alchemists were really doing. They did a really good job of hiding their secrets. And those secrets basically went with many of them to the grave. And it's only now in the past 20, 30 years that we have a pretty good sense of what they were up to in their laboratories throughout history. And so it's really neat to be at sort of the cutting edge of decoding some of these texts and decrypting some of these ideas so that we get an idea about, for instance, how a lot of these ideas developed, but also things like how acids developed. We take for granted in the industrial setting. I don't know if anyone here works in heavy industry, but obviously heavy industry is impossible without things like sulfuric acid. Well, sulfuric acid just doesn't pop into reality. It has to be made. And the history of just how that stuff got made was very, very mysterious until pretty recently. So to get a sense about Jewish alchemy specifically, we have to rewind and go back basically to where alchemy began. And we typically think of alchemy beginning as we know it in ancient Alexandria. Ancient Alexandria obviously was founded by Alexander the Great, who was incredibly humble to name every single thing after himself. But Alexandria in Egypt was one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world. In fact, it was second only to Rome in terms of its relative size in the Roman Empire. And it was intentionally cosmopolitan. Alexander the Great, for all of his faults, really wanted to create a world where Hellenistic culture could blend every single group of people together, and that basically the best and brightest could rise to the top. And in ancient Alexandria, that happened. The Jewish population in ancient Alexandria was also worth noting here. It was massive. The Jewish population in ancient Alexandria in the 4th century was larger than the entire Jewish population of Palestine. So more Jews lived in Alexandria, one city, than lived in all of Palestine. So there are enormous, the Jewish quarter basically was half of the city of ancient Alexandria. And of course, Alexandria is known for of many things, right? The famous library and other things as well. So this is a city of enormous sophistication. And it's a place where lots of different cultures are coming in contact with one another. And as you probably know, if you've ever had the chance to take a look at ancient Egyptian metalworking, you know that the Egyptians absolutely were incredible in their metalworking skills. If you've ever had the chance to see, for instance, the sarcophagus, the mask, the funeral mask of Tutankhamun, it is just incredible. The ability they had to work gold, for instance, is just mind-blowing. And we know that attached to many of what are called the houses of life, these are the ancient temple complexes in ancient Egypt, they had alchemical labs. That is to say, they had labs that were there primarily for the tinting of metals and the use of metals on religious statuary. Religious statuary was an incredibly important part of ancient Egyptian temple life, and they created very, very complex alloys and other kinds of metalwork in order to build their religious icons, these statues. So what we have is a very, very well-developed metallurgy history stretching back for millennia. But when the Jewish population moves into Alexandria, obviously they're not going to be using metalworking to make things like, well, gods, because that's not allowed in their religion. In Judaism, you probably know that in Judaism, we have a bad history with making, golden bulls and things like that. So that was a big no-no in Judaism. You don't make your gods out of metal. That's the, of the many things the Jewish people have gotten wrong, that was a big one. And so the technology was reapplied rather than making gods out of metal. The Jews there began to do the experimental work of transforming other things into metal. So this would be things like jewelry, and also just in general abstract experimentation with these various metals to sort of see how this goes. And what we see is that in this area, among the Jewish population in Alexandria, it seems that alchemy seems to begin with that population as we know it. Because it's the actual material technology from ancient Egypt, but being applied to a completely different set of purposes, not making religious statuary. And we know this because writings from ancient Egyptian alchemists have survived. We have the writings of Pseudo-Democritus, we have the writings of Zosimus of Panopolis, we have the writings of several different alchemists from around the years 200, 300, 400 of the Common Era, and they all agree the Jews at some level are responsible for many of these technological innovations. In fact, there are two places where both Zosimus of Panopolis, the most famous alchemist from this very early time period in Alexandria, and Pseudo-Democritus often refer to themselves as our race, and seem to indicate that they might have been Jewish themselves, although I think Zosimus was probably a Christian of some kind. Not that the sharp distinction between Jews and Christians had been forged at that point, but it's possible that many of them were Jewish. In fact, we know of the names of several different Jewish alchemists, one of which wrote a pretty comprehensive guide to the gold mines of ancient Egypt. Which, by the way, his book did not survive. It only survives in fragments. But even the fragments, we found some of the gold mines that he refers to, which is pretty neat, that he talks about those mines, and we've since found them. Just to give you an idea of some of the technological developments that occurred in ancient Egyptian alchemy, is there on the left-hand side of the screen. Of course, this is written in ancient Greek, so if anyone can read some Greek, you can begin the process of deciphering this. But you'll probably recognize this for anyone here who likes to drink whiskey or brandy. You'll recognize these as alembics or retorts. These are distillation apparati. Here we have one called the tribikos that has three different receiving vessels. Here we have one that's a singular receiving vessel. And well, you can see here the process of distillation. So distillation, as we now know it, if you've ever enjoyed a glass of whiskey or enjoyed a glass of brandy, this is some of the earliest images, in fact, the earliest images of distillation in history. So these survive from technical manuals from ancient Alexandria, which are, again, I think are really neat to think that this kind of stuff has been practiced for this long. There's no evidence, by the way, that they created alcohol with these. These are all being used to work with metals. The earliest the earliest instances of alcohol distillation don't occur until Europe in about the 13th century. It's interesting that the monks realized that the Muslims were using distillation of alcohol to make perfume. And then the monks realized, like, look, what you're saying is if we put anything in there, it makes it stronger on the other side. And the Muslims said, yeah, if you put stuff in there, it concentrates it on the other side. And so the Irish monks immediately began to put beer into it and outflow the other side, ishkiva, the water of life. And of course, ishkiva really quickly became our word whiskey. So thank you, Irish. Thank you, Irish folks, for that alchemical innovation. Perhaps the most famous of all of these alchemists from this time period is Maria the Jewess. The word Jewess is not really a thing anymore. I don't think anyone uses this kind of language anymore. But her name, unfortunately, is stuck. Maria Hebrea, Maria the Jewess. We know her by that name because she's referenced in several different alchemical texts from this time. And she's almost universally heralded as one of the earliest experts in alchemy. Zosimus of Panopolis, who was without a doubt the most important Alexandrian alchemist, consistently quotes from books that she wrote. None of her books, unfortunately, survive, but we have quotations from Zosimus, right, of things from her books that survive. This is an image of her from Michael Mayer's 17th century Atalante Fugians. So she's still being depicted literally 1,000 years later in European art in the alchemical works of the 17th century. We know nothing about her life aside from the fact that she was an Alexandrian Jewish woman. Women were actually active in alchemy pretty early on. We know the names of several different women who were active in alchemy, including Cleopatra, not Cleopatra the Seventh, another Cleopatra. But we know of Cleopatra. We know of several other women who were active in alchemy at this time as well. Exactly how women were able to rise to this degree of prominence in the ancient world, we don't know. But we do know their names, and we do know they were very highly respected. So Alexandria also may have been a bit more progressive in terms of women's rights issues as well. You may also know the Alexandrian philosopher Hypatia, who was also an important philosopher at that time, also a woman. Unfortunately, she was murdered by a mob. But she also was an important woman, a scientist and philosopher. Yeah, she was. She basically was. There was a Christian mob that basically thought that she was, evil, and broke into her classroom and killed her. She was lynched, which was really unfortunate. In fact, many philosophers think of the lynching of Hypatia as being basically the end of the classical world. That's where the classical world is. That's like it's it. After that, it's just we kind of into the dark ages when lynch mobs are killing philosophers. Not that philosophers can't get themselves killed for other good reasons. We're pretty good at that. Ask the wrong questions to the right people, and they will answer you by burning you alive. Maria the Jewess is known for lots of different things. In fact, if you've ever done some cooking, especially French cooking, you may recognize the name of the bain marie, or the Marienbad in German. These are double boilers that are used for very slowly heating up things in order to not scorch them. If you ever drank brandy, you can thank Maria the Jewess again, because not only did she invent the distillation apparatus as we know it, basically, but she also invented the double boiler. As you may know, when you make various kinds of fruit brandies, you can't directly apply heat, fire, to the bottom of the still, because it will scorch the inside of what's in there. And so what you do is you encase that still in a jacket of water, and you heat that water, and the water applies a constant amount of heat to the contents without scorching them. That is called a bain marie in French, and it's still used in cooking to this day. So her name literally survives into the culinary language of Europe all the way until today. She also developed distillation apparatus in glass. This must have been a technological marvel. Glass making in the ancient world was very, very difficult, and making basically glass works that are stable enough to be heated must have been a real technological marvel. That's still difficult, right, with the development of things like Pyrex today. And she also wrote several books on various kinds of furnaces. And these furnaces are really interesting because it shows some of the really early abilities to control heat. And so we have furnaces that provide direct and indirect heat, and then furnaces that can do things like basically operate as heat sinks. And so they can do passive heating through various kinds of mechanisms. These furnaces were developed by Maria. She also became known as Maria the Prophetess because apparently her teachings, it seems like they came to her in visions, so far as we can tell, in that she would undergo something like a trance state perhaps, and then she would shriek. The Greek is ekgrogazane. She would cry out these ideas that she had. And her most famous shrieking prophetic moment was when she declared famously that one becomes two, two become three, and by means of the third and the fourth, they achieve unity. Thus, two are not, they are one. All right, two are but one. This, again, has to do with, excuse me, her ideas of the fundamental unity of reality, that reality is one fundamentally unified thing, despite the fact that, from our perspective, it is disunited. It's disunited. But you also sometimes, again, see Maria referred to as not just as a Jewess, but as a prophet. This is an example of a double boiler being used in an early modern alchemical text, where you can see here that this boiler, right, would be filled with water, and it would heat this section up, and then the actual boiler down here would allow it to condense back over to this container here. It's a neat apparatus. So Maria also pioneered all kinds of other ideas. The idea that all of nature mirrors itself. That is to say, if you study anything in nature, you will find that nature mirrors itself in everything that nature produces. So if you study a human being's body, you can learn about the metals. If you study the metals, you can learn about human beings' bodies. She noticed that animals and human beings had structurally similar bodies, and therefore studying one could reveal things about the other. Something like really early comparative morphology. And the idea that that the microcosm and the macrocosm, that the universe itself is a giant system of reflections or refractions of one underlying unity. She would her books, like I said, they don't survive, unfortunately. We only have them in quotations from other writers. But she continued to be quoted all the way through the Islamic period, where Muslim alchemy, the Greeks basically passed away. The ideas were ultimately taken up in the Islamic world, and those alchemical ideas continued to develop in the Islamic world. In fact, it was in the Islamic world that they just made the major breakthroughs in things like the development of various kinds of acids. And her works continue to be quoted in Islamic works as well. What's interesting about that is that despite the fact that these societies are often very conservative and very male dominated, they seem to have no problem at all quoting from a woman as an authority. It seemed obvious to them that she was the undisputed authority, and that they never seemed to express any sort of odd ideas that why would a woman know these kinds of things. It's very clear that she's thought of as a great titanic genius. Also, what happens at this time period is that she kind of enters into legend. She is at some points associated with the flight of Mary and Joseph into Egypt, that Maria the Jewess rescued them, and then eventually she's actually confused with Mary, Jesus's mother, at some point, which is very odd that Mary and Joseph took Jesus into Egypt, and then Mary did some alchemy and went back to Palestine. It's a very strange idea, but it was a not uncommon idea at this time. And eventually what ends up happening is that Maria the Jewess is actually conflated all the way back with Moses' sister. You know, Moses' sister Miriam. This idea is that basically Moses was the revealer of the supernatural law, but Mary was the revealer of the natural law, right? That she understood the fundamentals of nature, whereas her brother Moses understood the nature of God. And so you have this interesting mirroring where Moses is sort of the prophet of the world, of the supernatural world, the divine world, whereas his sister is the prophetess of this world. She understands how this world operates. So it's an interesting kind of mirroring where we get this character of Maria the Jewess, who we know as a historical person, becoming mixed up with all kinds of various kinds of legends. It's worth just pointing this out before I move on. She is the earliest recorded alchemist that we know by name. So it's worth pointing out that we think of the sciences as being very dominated by men through history, but the earliest chemist, the earliest alchemist we actually know by name, who was a real historical person, was a Jewish woman from ancient Alexandria. So why that doesn't get pointed out more in science classes, I don't know. It's weird. Although the word scientist was also invented first to describe women. Before the word scientist was only used to describe women. Before that, men simply called themselves men of science. But then women started doing it, and they didn't know what to call them, because you can't call them men of science. And so they started calling them scientists. And that is where the word scientist ultimately emerged, was for them trying to figure out what to call women scientists. So it stuck. As you can imagine, from a lot of these ideas, alchemy and Kabbalah are going to be a match made in heaven. Kabbalah, as you may know, is a Jewish form of mysticism. It's not all of Jewish mysticism. It's one form. And this is the image here is the first edition of the Sefer Zohar, the most important text in the development of Kabbalah, published in Mantua. It's a really beautiful thing. You'll notice that the curvy columns here are the exact same columns that are actually found in St. Peter's Basilica. The sort of curvy columns are there. Interestingly enough, on the cover of a Jewish book of mysticism, the columns from St. Peter's Basilica are there in the image. Mix and match things. I have no idea, folks. It's just weird. But at any rate, Kabbalah, as you may know, is a form of Jewish mysticism that's heavily interested in speculating about the nature of God. The Sephirot are very famous, these emanations of God, and these kinds of ideas that God is a process rather than a thing. These ideas were very, very powerful in the development of Kabbalah. And of course, when alchemy entered into Europe on February the 11th, 1144, there was only a matter of time until Kabbalistic ideas and alchemical ideas would be melded together, and they definitely were. In fact, the very areas in which alchemy first enters Europe, primarily through Spain into France, that is exactly the area in which alchemy would actually enter Europe as well. And it's in some of the really early Jewish mystical texts, like the Zohar, the image pictured here on the right, excuse me, that we see alchemical ideas as early on as that Jewish mystical text. There's a curious idea, and this will be, I think, interesting for folks, for Freemason folks, is that Solomon it's often wondered how Solomon became very, very wealthy. And according to this Jewish mystical text, what happened was that King David was able to sing to the moon, which of course was made of silver, and he was able to perfect the moon, and the rays of the moon would shine down upon Israel and convert all of the sand there into gold. And of course, there's a very famous line in the Bible where it says that in Solomon's days, the silver and gold were basically worthless because there was so much of them. And the idea was that reason why the silver and gold were basically worthless was because everything had been converted to silver and gold by David's Kabbalistic wooing of the moon. And so there's this really beautiful section in the Zohar, this Jewish mystical text, that describes David as a kind of alchemist using music to convert the moon and the rays of the moon into sort of a quasi-magical ability to transform Israel. I've been to Israel and I did not notice any sand made of gold. I noticed a lot of sand. So Solomon must have gotten all of it while he was around, that greedy bastard. So I did not find any gold sand lying around, unfortunately. But a neat story anyway from the 1280s here in this Jewish mystical text. Many alchemists, non-Jewish alchemists, would often claim that Jewish alchemists had taught them the art. We see this happening over and over again. Many Christians would claim that they had gone secretly to a Jewish master of alchemy, and that Jewish master of alchemy had taught them various kinds of secrets. Now, we don't know if this is because they really were going to Jewish alchemists. They may have been, in fact, or because Jews were sort of romanticized, right? And some they had secret knowledge or something like that. But what we do see in some of these alchemical texts written by Christians are characters written in Hebrew, right? Things written in Hebrew, but the Hebrew is often badly misspelled. So they're getting some kind of Hebrew from somewhere. And so you can see here, right, that the printer here of the Hebrew letters here, they can't quite make them out exactly, and this is separated off in a weird way. And so the Hebrew often gets garbled. But the Hebrew is not coming from nowhere, and the Christians don't know much in the way of Hebrew, so they're certainly learning it from someone. So we get ideas that that some of these people like Raimondo Lowell or Nicolas Flamel, two very famous alchemists, one Catalonian and one French, both of them claim that they learned alchemy from Jewish practitioners, probably in Spain, but again, the trail on a lot of this stuff gets really, really murky when you try to really trace it down. But we think that they were probably telling the truth, at least at some level. We also have a pretty big translation effort here during the Middle Ages to translate a lot of stuff from Hebrew and into Hebrew. And one of the really famous works of this time period is Rabbi Avraham Eliezer's Old Age chemical work, which is the image here on the left-hand side. This is the famous snail, or the famous snake eating its own tail. This image of the Ouroboros, which you see in a great deal of her esoteric texts, actually goes back all the way to ancient Egypt. In fact, I mentioned Cleopatra earlier, the alchemist, female alchemist Cleopatra. It's actually in one of her works called the Chrysopoeia, the gold-making manuscript, where we see the image of the Ouroboros for the first time. And so again, another place where a woman alchemist, a female alchemist, has introduced very iconic imagery into the history of Hermetic philosophy that continues until this day. I often see people with Ouroboros tattoos, and and I'm like, yeah, that idea goes back all the way to women alchemists in ancient Alexandria. You can see another example here. This is a great example where Hebrew gets really garbled. I don't know how many folks can read Hebrew here, but this is backwards. They just don't really understand how this goes. This is the word sefer, which sefer means book. And this is just really badly misspelled. At some point, what ends up happening is, and this is just backwards too. This letter should be at the end. Yeah, it's just completely backwards. What ends up happening sometimes in these manuscripts is that the original writer doesn't really know Hebrew, and the printer certainly doesn't know Hebrew. And so by the time it gets actually printed out, things get flipped and turned upside down, and things get written backwards, and Hebrew just comes a bunch of squiggles. So this happens in the history of and this kinds of thing. But again, you can see here this image of the Jewish alchemist. He's sort of dressed, interestingly enough, as something like a priest or a king. And again, we have this Hebrew here that's all garbled, but still indicating the idea that the writer here is trying to claim that the ideas come from Hebrew. This book, the Old Age Chemical Work of Abraham Eliezer, is really famous for its illustrations. And we have a great deal of these kinds of works that have survived and are very, very fascinating. What's also interesting during this time period is that even Jewish writers who were opposed to alchemy, Maimonides, the very famous Jewish philosopher, was himself opposed to alchemy. He thought mostly the alchemists were a bunch of frauds and they couldn't really do what they claimed. What's really funny is that people start writing books as if they're Maimonides, publishing alchemical works under his name, which I'm sure had him rolling in his grave. But we have some of these works by what is called pseudo Maimonides, where he claims that he just says in public he doesn't like alchemy, but really he's a practicing alchemist on the sly. And we have some of these ideas coming from largely Sephardi alchemists there in Spain and then in France. What's also interesting about Jewish alchemy at this time is that Jewish alchemy and the transmutation of metals is also connected to the idea of messianic redemption, where there is an idea that's found in Jewish alchemy, which is interesting, where the Messiah will eventually come and redeem all of humanity, but it's the alchemy that has a kind of messianic power too, and the ability of the alchemist is to basically redeem nature, which is to say that the Messiah will come and fix the world spiritually, but the alchemists have the unique and maybe unlucky job of fixing the world physically. And so there's an idea in Jewish alchemy that the task of the alchemist is to transform nature in order to perfect it, which again is an interesting parallel between the idea that spiritual redemption and physical redemption are somehow going to be unified in the image of the Messiah. And there is a tone in Jewish texts from this time where even the Messiah himself will be an alchemist. That is to say, the Messiah will understand how to fundamentally transform nature, and that transformation of nature will also come with a transformation of reality more generally. And there's a kind of vast spiritual alchemy that will transmute both. So again, an interesting idea where, again, religion and science, which we typically think of as utterly not willing to talk to one another, but of course in this time period, they're more than happy. In fact, the idea is that basically they're one thing at some level, that the alchemists and the mystics are kind of doing something of the same. They're kind of doing two sides of the same coin in some sense. Another really famous alchemical text that was developed at this time in Jewish alchemy, where it's a text that very explicitly combines Jewish mysticism or Kabbalah into alchemy. And this is a text called the Eish Metzaref, which is only preserved in Latin, unfortunately. The original Hebrew translation has been lost. In fact, even the Latin edition is a translation from Italian. So it went from Hebrew to Italian to Latin, and we've lost everything but the Latin. But we're confident it was originally written in Hebrew because of some of the curious kinds of things that are in there. But the Eishmetz Aref is a document that literally just means the refiner's fire. It's a quotation from the book of Micah, where God is described as subjecting the Israelites to the refiner's fire to purify them. Again, linking purification both from a spiritual, but also from a metallic point of view. And what we have, interestingly enough, in this text is a combination of magic, Kabbalah, and alchemy, right? So again, if you're gonna go in, go all the way in, right? If you're really you're gonna be weird. Don't halfway do weird. Just go all in. And this writer combined alchemy, magic, and Kabbalah. What's interesting about some of the magical stuff here is we find very similar magical squares. I'm sure folks have seen magical squares like the famous Sator square, right? Where if you add up the numbers, they add up to one number go this way and one number they go that way. Or words that spell in the same square over and over and over again. You see them sometimes, even as back as the Roman Empire. What's interesting about the magical squares that are found in this book, in the Eishmetz Aref, and I've made a whole episode on just this text on my YouTube channel if you want to check that out, is that some of the magical squares also occur in Albrecht Dürer. You may know him for his very famous woodcuts. And also they occur in Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. Now we don't know how all these connect, but it's very clear that the writer of this text has a deep knowledge of both alchemy, Kabbalah, and magic. And this is again the classic image of the Kabbalist with the giant tomes with the strange bubbling chemicals, halfway. They're somewhere between conjuring and science. But this is a text that very much combines all of those things in once. In fact, what it does is it tries to combine them in a way that to unify all these forms of knowledge into one grand system of knowledge, which again, one can wonder about to what degree one can combine Kabbalah, magic, and alchemy. But I think the basic impulse there is one we still share in the modern world, and that is the idea that we want a grand unified theory of physics. We want to understand how all the sciences work together, and one unified theory of all that is, it's still in the works. So they're still cooking it up over there and wherever, and in the laboratories of the universities. But this writer attempts a grand unified synthesis of all that material. I can't say that they achieved it, but hell of a try. Hell of a try. Really fascinating. The image here to the left is from a book called De Distillatione, on distillation. What's really neat about this image is that you can see here there's a metal shaft here. Many of the alchemical alembics that you've seen in previous images did not have condensing. They did not have condensers, right? You need a condenser in order to take the vapor being created here and to put it back in this vessel. You'll notice here that this entire rod is a giant condenser full of cold water. And you can see the tap here with the water running out and them heating various kinds of things here as it goes up the condensing system to collect there. So again, a really neat, really cool distillation apparatus. This one I think is from the 16th century. I think so. I think 16th or 17th century. Also, by the way, you'll notice this glasswork here. This would have been incredibly difficult glasswork. I don't know if any folks here have experience with blowing glass or working in glass, but to create glass that can withstand these kinds of pressures and these kinds of heating, and also be able to curve in this kind of way, this is incredibly detailed precision glass making work. And so this kind of work would have been a technological marvel back in its day. In fact, I think even seeing glass blown like this now would be very, very impressive. That could withstand those kinds of torture. Perhaps the most famous alchemist of all time, or rather most famous Kabbalist of all time, was Chaim Vital. Now, you may know his teacher better than you know him. His teacher, of course, was Rabbi Itzhak Luria. He basically developed Kabbalah as we know it. So if you've ever seen the images of the Sephirot, or if you ever heard the ideas of Tikkun Olam, all those Kabbalistic ideas basically were developed in the late 16th century by a Egyptian Kabbalist named Itzhak Luria. Luria moved to Israel, to the area that is now called Sfat, the city of Sfat. And he taught for 3 years and promptly died. And this is always a problem with these people. They show up, they change the world, and they die, and then we can't ask them any damn questions. But he died, and at any rate, the Kabbalistic teachings that he left behind were primarily developed by his student, Chaim Vital, who was a very, very strange but very ingenious person. Those typically go together, I guess. But being genius makes you strange, but you can be strange without being a genius. I know lots of strange people who aren't geniuses, unfortunately. Chaim Vital was known as a huge developer of Kabbalah. But what people often don't know about him was that he was a practitioner of both alchemy and medicine. I don't think I'd want to go to him for his medical help. He's also an exorcist, by the way. He pioneered modern Jewish exorcism, which is actually going on. In fact, there are more Jewish possession cases now in the past 20 years than there were in the past 200 years combined. I don't know why it is. Also, this is true in the Catholic world too. Catholics are performing more exorcisms now than they have in the past several hundred years. The largest collection of exorcists join every year in Italy for a giant exorcist conference in the Vatican. And they recently republished the protocols for how to engage in exorcism because they're having to use them again. So this is happening a lot more now for whatever reason. I don't know why. The world's getting eviler. I suppose that's believable. But at any rate, he was also an exorcist as well. What we have actually is a manuscript that has survived from Chaim Vital's library that contains an enormous amount of alchemical lore. In fact, he seems to have written about as much on alchemy as he did Kabbalah. And we have alchemical recipes. We have recipes for converting lead to gold. I can't tell you that they work. I've not tried them. These recipes are often very dangerous, as you might imagine. They involve all kinds of toxic chemicals that there's a reason why alchemists don't live very long. They're surrounding themselves with exploding glass filled with mercury. So you can imagine that that doesn't make for a long life. At any rate, Chaim Vital left behind a vast amount of alchemical lore showing that he was very, very interested in alchemy and was performing alchemical experiments. So just as much as he was doing Kabbalah, he was also engaged in alchemy as well. This is on the right-hand side. You can see here a very famous image of from the Kabbalah. This is a system of the Sephirot. I'm sure many folks have seen this before. These are the divine emanations that flow from the inner recesses of God up here down to here at Malchut, which is, we could draw a little thing here. You are here. Yeah, you are down here at the bottom. And that the bridge between the infinity of God and the finiteness of our world is bridged by a system of interlocking emanations of the divine. This is an idea very common in Jewish mysticism. And Chaim Vital is one of the people who really pioneered this system of mysticism, which is still very popular from Madonna to lots of people. Kabbalah remains very, very popular. Lastly, right, just sort of the grand tour of all this. You can see here this image on the left is another very complicated alchemical allegory of the various kinds of ways in which gold and silver are cooked in a womb here. And that womb white is the process by which these things are transmuted. So images of wombs, images of these kinds of vessels being sealed deep within the earth, right? So we have images of various kinds of things being prepped in the earth. And here we have someone praying. You can see the name of God there in Hebrew. Again, the alchemist as sort of a healer of both, a spiritual healer, but also a metaphysical and physical healer at the same time. Again, here with the alchemist working here in the bowels of the earth. So what we have at the very end of this entire story at some level is that alchemical manuscripts continue to be produced all the way through the 17th century, even as alchemy now begins to transition into what we call chemistry. One way the story gets told, chemists like to tell this story because they're wrong. Chemists like to tell the story that that chemistry just woke up one day and thought, hey, alchemists are full of it. Let's invent chemistry and let's be modern, rational people. That never happened. The very same people doing alchemy were the very same people that developed chemistry. In fact, it's impossible not to read medieval alchemical texts as anything other than chemical texts. But though what does happen is that there is a transition. I can speak maybe a little bit more of that later, but there is a transition from what we would now recognize as alchemy, attempting to turn lead into gold, and more attempts to do other kinds of things. I'll give you one example. One of the big things that many people hired alchemists to do was try to turn lead into gold, especially during precious metal famines. So if I'm a king and my silver mine just collapsed, well, I might hire alchemists to try to make gold for me or make silver for me. Well, it turns out they can't. At least I haven't met any that can. If I did know people who could make lead and gold and silver, I wouldn't be here. You fine gentlemen, I would be doing something else with all my gold and silver. But they did have other skills, right? They discovered all kinds of other skills along the way in the process of trying to make gold and silver. And so what they began to learn was how to make other kinds of things. And one of the things that they learned, for instance, how to make very, very well was very, very pure potassium nitrate. Now, potassium nitrate, beginning in around the 17th century, is going to be incredibly important because they're also beginning to discover the need for ballistics at this time. Because as you probably know, the basic components of gunpowder are potassium nitrate, saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. Well, sulfur occurs naturally, and so does charcoal. Well, you can burn it and get charcoal pretty easily. But high quality potassium nitrate rarely occurs in nature. So you have to make it, right? And who could make this stuff other than the alchemists? And they did. And as you can imagine, at some level, right, making gunpowder, while it isn't making lead into gold, well, if you have a gun, you can point that gun at people and you can convert all kinds of things into gold. It's amazing how easily guns will get you gold. Guns will get you gold faster than alchemy will. So it's a little indirect, but the alchemist did get the gold. Just got it at the end of a howitzer. So these are the kinds of transitions that you see happening in the alchemical world. They're not abandoning making gold and silver, but why try to make gold and silver if you can get a steady day job making things like potassium nitrate? And we know that alchemists began to make that transition beginning in the 17th century. In the Jewish world, knowledge of alchemy at this time was beginning to pass away, and even as late as the 18th century, 1700s, even around 1776, where there are practicing alchemists in this part of the world as well, many Jewish people were beginning to ask, does anyone still know anything about alchemy? And by the late 18th century, knowledge of alchemy had basically passed away from the Jewish world. And curiously enough, after nearly 2,000 years of continuous Jewish engagement with the alchemical process, at least in the European world by the 18th century, knowledge of it had basically gone the way of the dodo. However, as late as the 19th century, Jewish alchemists on the Isle of Yerba, off the coast of Tunisia, were still producing alchemical manuscripts. 1865 is the time where the Civil War is still fresh here, right? So you can think that at some level, right, Sherman could have made the long journey to Tunisia, right? Not burning anything or whatever, but he could have made the journey to Tunisia, and Sherman and Grant could have sat down with a Jewish alchemist in 1865 and have gone to an alchemical laboratory there off the Isle of Tunisia. And so far as we can tell, that document being produced in 1865 is the latest, the final alchemical text published in the Western world. So we have an interesting kind of bookended situation here with the history of alchemy. The earliest known alchemist that we know by name was Maria the Jewess, and the very last alchemical text that we have being published as part of a continuous tradition of alchemy was being published off the island off the coast of Tunisia in 1865. In some sense, bookmarking or bookending the entire history of alchemy from the very beginnings and there in ancient Alexandria, all the way through the Middle Ages and the development of modern chemistry, and then all the way into the 19th century. In 1865, we have the last text, alchemical text being published. And so in some sense, alchemy has a Jewish history. It begins in Alexandrian, with an Alexandrian Jewish woman at some level, and it ends there off the coast of Tunisia, now just a couple centuries ago. So alchemy has a really fabulous and very interesting history. And what often people don't know, and I've given this talk to Jewish congregations, is that they have no idea, right? They have no idea as well. Many people know very little about alchemy, but also know very little about the fact that this was an esoteric science that was practiced in large part by Jewish people, of course, practiced by many, many other people as well, but practiced by Jewish people for millennia, 2 millennia, basically. So I think a very interesting avenue, a very interesting window into a world that often doesn't get understood. And again, like I said, it doesn't get understood because it's just in the past 30, 40 years that we're beginning to unpack a lot of this stuff. And so for people who think, I tell my students that for people who think that we basically understand the entire gist of the ancient world, I tell them, you're not looking hard enough. You must be crazy. The ancient world is still holding on to its mysteries. And increasingly what we're coming to realize and increasingly what we're coming to know is that the ancient peoples of ancient Alexandria, the ancient peoples of the Middle Ages, they were a lot wiser and a lot smarter and a lot more technically sophisticated than we give them credit for. And I feel like part of my desire to study things like alchemy or the history of these kinds of topics is because it not only gives me a glimpse onto human nature, but it also gives me a glimpse into how I can so deeply appreciate my ancestors, whether they be scientific ancestors or their ancestors, because to write off ancient peoples or medieval peoples as backwards and superstitious and stupid or whatever, these kinds of weird ideas that have gotten their grips into us somehow, that we think we've arrived, that we're the best thing since sliced bread, us modern people. I find that to be the height of arrogance. And so the more we uncover about these people and the more we learn how ingenious they were, for me at least, the more humbled and the more appreciative I get that of the modern world as being gifted to us by the heroic brilliance of medieval and ancient peoples, as opposed to modern world people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. That didn't happen. It just didn't happen. Well, folks, thank you so much. I'm happy to take questions or talk about things adjacent to alchemy or whatever, or Kabbalah. I'm happy to take any questions at all, but I really appreciate, thank you guys for your attention.
Well, let me unmute. Thank you, Justin. I do appreciate that. That was very in-depth. I see Brother Dreyfus has a question. Go ahead.
Just one to start with. Did any of the alchemists, Jewish, Christian, or otherwise, use their devices in a symbolic manner, such as, for instance, using the retort as an emblem of purification, something that would remind them to do in their ordinary lives?
So one of the things that's interesting about the alchemists is that for them, what they were doing wasn't separate from every other aspect of their life. We tend to make this division between spirituality and reason, or religion and science, or something like that. That's sort of this weird artificial fight that we put that these people didn't have. They didn't have that kind of, this is the kind of baggage that makes us stupid, that they didn't have to suffer from. And so because they didn't suffer from that kind of false dichotomy that science and religion or science and faith are inherently conflicting, well, for them, everything was part of one giant continuum. And so something like the retort, right, would be not only a physical object they'd be working with every day in order to trying to find the philosopher's stone or what have you, but absolutely, it would be images of spiritual purity, of ethical purity. In fact, a big idea in alchemy was that nature did not yield to evil, right? That nature didn't yield to evil. And that if you became an alchemist just because you wanted to make gold and make yourself fabulously wealthy, nature would resist you. Nature would actually actively sabotage you because you're trying to use something made by God to do something evil. And so nature revolts at that. And so there's an interesting idea where the alchemist has to become, at some level, ethically pure to be able to engage in the kind of transformatory arts that they wanted to engage in. And I tell my students, modern science could learn a lesson here, right? Just because you can make an atomic bomb doesn't imply you should. Can does not imply should, a very important moral lesson we could all learn. And again, you think about many of the scientists that worked on the Manhattan Project, many of those guys, not all of them, but many of them, when they saw that bomb go off, they were like, what have I done? Well, just because you can doesn't mean you should. But what's interesting about the alchemists is that for them, being ethically upright at some level was part and parcel of their trade. Now, that's not to say they weren't criminal alchemists up to shenanigans. We definitely know that those existed. In fact, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire had a gold-plated gibbet made, and every time an alchemist claimed that they could make lead into gold and they failed to do it, they got hanged on the gold-plated gibbet. And so this is something I love. And the Middle Ages is incredibly brutal, but there's something immensely poetic about the very fraud you commit being the mechanism by which you dance the last dance, I guess. But yeah, the idea there is that some degree of ethical purity and some degree of spiritual purity was a big part of many alchemical texts.
Can I have one quick follow-up?
Sure.
That is there documentation at all that this idea of spiritual purity being achieved through working tools crossed over during the Enlightenment or even before to, say, Enlightenment England? And the reason I'm asking, of course, is that's where
Of course, yeah.
Our brotherhood began.
Yeah, ora et labora. Yeah, pray and work. This is the classic idea of the Middle Ages. It's a good question about to what degree these things sort of crossed over. It would seem, I mean, it would be a big interesting mix, because the Enlightenment has a very weird relationship with alchemy. On the one hand, there are some Enlightenment folks that are really practicing alchemy and they're all about it. Newton being an example, right? And there are other Enlightenment people who really hate alchemy. They really think that alchemy is symbolic of everything backwards and medieval and superstitious. And so it's interesting, alchemy is sort of in the crosshairs of how this entire story is going to pan itself out. It would seem very, I would be very impressed if the amount of early Masons and the amount of alchemists at that time period, there have to be huge overlap. I'm absolutely sure. I feel like George Starkey and people like that, who was a American alchemist and who was very much hobnobbing with the Freemason world of that time. There has to be a very strong overlap. Now, exactly how that overlap goes, I don't know. But at that point, alchemy would have been on its last leg by the 18th century. But the idea that those two things aren't overlapping at all would seem very unlikely to me.
Good. Anyone else with a question?
Well, I'll ask another. I'm not proud.
Well, I'll see if there's anybody else first, but yes.
Okay.
No, any other participants have a question?
And I'm happy to take questions, alchemy or Jewish mysticism or more broadly. So feel free to.
I did want to note that we do have, and the way you pronounce, I've been taught to say Kabbalah, which is the way almost everybody I've heard pronounce it. You pronounce it. Can you say it again, please?
Yeah, Kabbalah. I put the
Kabbalah.
In Hebrew, typically the stress is put on the last syllable. So Kabbalah would be a more Hebrew style pronunciation. But some people say Kabbalah. Now that I try to do it, I can't do it.
Right. It's
Kabbalah, right?
Kabbalah is the way
Yeah.
that I hear it.
Yeah.
I don't know how much you interact with the Masons and how much you've picked up of what are symbolisms and all, but the Scottish Rite, which is one of the appendant bodies of Masonry, once you join a Blue Lodge, there's other bodies you can join, like the Royal Arch and the Shrine and the Scottish Rite, that they claim to offer more in-depth study of the basic things you learn in the Blue Lodge. The Scottish Rite is very centered on the Kabbalah, and in the 4th degree, they show the symbol, the one you showed that had the 9. What is the name of that?
It's called the Eitz Chaim, the Tree of Life.
Tree of Life, yes.
Yeah, the Tree of Life. Yeah, but it's they're called the Sephirot, the it's a word that we can't, it's hard to translate in English, but the sort of emanations of the divine.
Okay. I'll see if I can find something to send you what we have written about it. You might find that interesting because I was waiting to see something like that because they do reference the Kabbalah in the Scottish Rite, primarily in the 4th degree, and it comes up in some of the later degrees. And there's a lot of numerology type stuff that you see in the Scottish Rite. And it's funny, I feel like I have to over explain, but the Scottish Rite is what it's called. It's a set of 29 degrees, but they came essentially, we think, out of Scotland, but mainly were put together in France.
Yeah.
So they were French when
Yeah.
it came to the Caribbean and then to Charleston in America, where it spread, and
Right.
then other countries around the world picked it up.
Yeah,
But,
French Freemasonry has like the Cohen something. I can't remember the French Freemasonry is really. I've actually some Freemasons from France and from Sweden have actually reached out to me because they have manuscripts written in codes that are Kabbalistic in nature, and they've reached out because the actual lodges have the people that can read them have passed on centuries ago.
Right.
And so they're like, we don't know what these mean, and so
Right.
we have to reach to an outside expert. So so for especially French Freemasonry, I've seen a lot of really, really interesting intersections of Kabbalah, alchemy,
Right.
And things like that mixed together.
And I mentioned the, oh, I'm sorry, Ira, if you had another question, if you have to leave, go ahead. Okay. Thank you for coming and asking most of our questions so far, but we appreciate it. As I was saying, Justin, is what I've noticed in the Scottish Rite is they have, lost a couple guys there. We have a lot of numerology and a lot of intense amount of symbolism. And they say Masonry is expressed through symbols. We use symbolism, and that's what Ira was hinting at, is where, we use working tools, what the men who built the cathedrals in Europe, the plumb, the square, the level, the trowel, and all these other things, and they apply a symbolic meaning to it, so that just as you would use a plumb to make sure that a stone is true up and down, a Mason used it as a plumb to set his life so he lives a straight life. And it's very simplistic. It's very easy to get across, but the whole idea is working Masons, the tools that they use were converted into what we call speculative Masons, where we use those tools as symbols in our teachings to say, here's how you become a better person by using the working tools as a guide. So when you see them, you're reminded of the lesson you learned, and all right, I need to be a straight person. I need to act on the square. And a lot of our ritual came into common parlance, like, acting on the square with someone, being square, treating someone fairly, whatever. But the Scottish Rite, what I found interesting in it is most of what we know today was not what the original degrees were, but there's a man named Albert Pike, who you probably heard of, who basically rewrote all of our rituals in the 1800s. And that's what we've had for the last 150 some years, is the Albert Pike version of all of our rituals. And he spent a lot of time writing in great detail about the meaning and the symbolism of all of the rites. And I'm always curious about, well, what did he change from was he a really good editor and just kind of cleaned it up so you can understand it? Or did he just sort of put his own ideas in there? So we don't really know.
No, right. Yeah.
There's a lot of numerology and symbolism, and supposedly there are much deeper mysteries, the esoterica of what Masonry teaches. And what I've gathered from my reading on it is the original Masons were trying to carry forth from one generation to the next, from one century to the next, all the deep inner secrets of life that all these centuries and millennia of mankind has uncovered, all of these the deep mysteries of the universe that were often lost because barbarians would come along and wipe out a civilization, and then all of the smart people would get killed off and you wouldn't have anything left. And the whole idea was, through secret work, they'd be able to carry on these great mysteries, but they didn't want to just say, come on and join the lodge, and okay, son, you paid your $100. Here's the mysteries of life. Here's all the secrets laid out for you so anyone could read them and understand them. The whole idea was you had to spend a lot of time trying to interpret them on your own and understand them. So there's this much deeper meaning to Masonry that's below the surface. And most of what we taught, and what most Masons today, some say, most of what we spend our time doing is sort of trivial stuff to entertain the masses, and those who really want to understand it really have to dig in on their own and understand the deeper truths behind it. And alchemy is one of the things that we touch on. I'm trying to crystallize all of this, what I've heard, into one short paragraph for you. But basically, that's the whole idea. There's a much deeper meaning to Masonry that most of us don't really know about. Only so many percentage of Masons out of the whole actually are trying to understand the deeper mysteries that it's trying to pass along.
Mhm.
And I guess I wonder, it's like, well, have we reached a point where all we have are the people who know the surface teachings, and that's what we've taught, and we've totally lost track of all the real good stuff that's underneath that we all really wanted when we joined? We never get to experience, and we've only been taught the surface stuff, and that's all we know, because all the men who know the surface stuff died out.
Yeah,
This is a teaching.
right. This is an interesting thing. I have like on my channel, my YouTube channel, I have a lot of Freemasons that watch the channel, and they've reached out to me. And one of the reasons why they say that they watch the channel is that, some of the texts that I'm working with, they've heard of in Freemason conversations. But
Yes.
for instance, some of the texts that I'll mention, they only exist in Latin. They've never been translated. And so I make episodes on those texts. I read them in Latin, and I make the information. And so I've had Freemasons come and say, yeah, that text gets referenced in X, Y, and Z, but no one can read it because there are hardly anybody who knows where these texts are can read them in Latin. And so like, it's interesting that they're like, yeah, as a Freemason, I'm going to a non-Freemason because that's the only person that has the access to the text in the original language or whatever. Right. So it's kind of I feel really humbled and really, thankful to have, Freemason folks who are coming to the channel because they want to learn some of this stuff, and hopefully, they'll take it back to their lodges, and it'll be enriching in some kind of way. So I hope that's happening. That would be really great.
We need to get some Masons to start learning Latin again, I guess, because
yeah, I mean,
it's not taught in American schools at all. It's taught in a few colleges. I think in England I don't know. Brian, is it still at the high school, grade school level of? Do they still teach Latin?
Yes, it is. There is actually several courses that are available for it, and there's what we call a GCSE, which is General Certificate of Secondary Education course on it. So yeah, it's still taught.
Okay. It seems to be only
not everywhere. It's sort of just some.
It's in America. It seems to be mostly the private schools that teach you, the religious schools. Yeah. They make an effort to teach Latin. For the average, it's like, no, it's not important, so we don't teach anymore.
Right. Yeah. I mean, just even basic knowledge of Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, which are were essential languages to any scholar to have learned a couple centuries ago. Right. Finding someone who has all three is very rare these days.
Indeed.
You were mentioning earlier the Malleus Maleficarum. Is there a sort of Jewish version of that?
The Malleus Maleficarum?
Yeah.
No. It's interesting that Judaism never went through the witch trials. Basically, the Jewish populations, that process never really turned in the Jewish community itself. There was never an attempt to sort of root out witches, and for pretty simple reasons. Judaism doesn't really have a devil, and so the idea that there are witches hanging out in the forest and making pacts with the devil to undermine Judaism doesn't make any sense if you don't have a devil. And so the very logic of the witch trials often didn't really. Now, that's not to say that Christians didn't arrest Jews for being witches. It's that Jews didn't arrest other Jews for being witches.
Yeah.
When you have a quota, we.
No, right. Yeah. You got to get so many tickets and arrest so many witches. But no, there was never sort of a witch hunting craze that ever went through in the Jewish world. And Jewish magic lived and thrived through the Middle Ages as well. Yeah. Lots of Jewish magical texts that were written down. I can't say they were always completely kosher, but it was certainly practiced, and people did it, and pretty sure you can get in trouble for it, but you weren't going to get burned.
So Judaism doesn't have any sort of evil spirits or possession or any of that sort of thing. I mean, you mentioned exorcisms. Though.
Yeah, so it does have possession, but possession occurs via evil dead people and not via demons. So
okay.
So it's ghosts, basically, evil ghosts possessing people, I guess. But Judaism does have a pretty complex demonology, but it doesn't have a kind of one bad guy. There's no devil character, no singular devil character. There are demonic beings in the Jewish world. In fact, the Talmud says that there are thousands to your left and 10,000 to your right. The world's full of these demons.
Right.
But they're kind of they're like supernatural pests
Mhm.
in Judaism, as opposed to like super scary. So they exist in a slightly different way in Judaism than they do in Christianity.
It's interesting. I don't, from what I've read about this, we would consider now what they called witches in the Salem witch trials in that era, of course, were being, it was the devil. It was, 12 witches and Satan at the head. That's why 13 is an unlucky number and all that. It was tied directly to the devil. But I would
Another
say
British import.
if you met a witch today, they would actually be pretty close to be an alchemist. They were in tune with nature, much like the Druids and what all witches today that practice witchcraft has nothing to do with Christianity or Satanism. That's a totally alien world. They're in their own total lane altogether. Right. And you could argue that a witch is pretty much close to a alchemist today. Is very much in tune with nature and crafting nature and pulling the forces of nature together to make their spells and potions. So you really could argue a witch actually is an alchemist.
Yeah, I mean, and also just that, there's no good evidence there actually were even witches in the Middle Ages. Like,
right.
There's no evidence of the witches' Sabbath. I mean, again, the witch craze, I just made an episode on the witch craze, the demonologists that underwrote the witch craze. It was basically something like a primitive conspiracy theory. If you think about how conspiracy theories operate, the Inquisitors were basically conspiracy theorists, and they executed between 40 and 60,000 women on garbage evidence, tortured evidence, and I saw you in a dream cavorting with the devil, and therefore you must be a witch, and spectral evidence that counted that counted as evidence in the Salem witch trials. And that, by the way, that after the disaster of the trials, at least at Salem, and people forget that the Salem trials were just one. There was the Connecticut trial, 1648, and also the Bermuda trial. There was a massive trial, a witch trial in Bermuda. But it was actually in the aftermath of those trials that we had in the United States or the early colonies where we actually had a dramatic change in how we did the legal system, where evidence had to be actual evidence, not just here's a bunch of made up stuff that I saw you in a dream. So the upshot was that it did actually help to reform the legal system in a pretty dramatic way. It led to the end of legal torture and things like this too.
Had to get so bad before we did something about it.
Yeah, sometimes, that's the way history goes. And what is Hegel said, that history is a slaughter bench. It often gets much worse before it gets better. And so, unfortunately, I think that's true.
What I find interesting is about that book, Witch's Hammer, is that one of the first things it says, one of the first paragraphs, is that not all women are witches, some are healers and good people. And yet that bit seemed to have been overridden completely, ignored completely. They went for and of course our Witchfinder General was a really wonderful fellow, including the free ones.
The Malus Maleficarum is just a fascinating text in lots of ways, and especially like how we think of it as being really for instance, we think of the Inquisition sort of carrying it around and it being their textbook. The Inquisition didn't like it. The Inquisition thought it was a really reckless. They tried to have it suppressed, and it wasn't actually as popular. It's popular now, but it wasn't as popular back in the day. Yeah. So this book has an interesting history, and it also has to do with the fact that the main guy that wrote it was engaging in such terrible torture of women that the local bishop had to step in and say, stop, right? You can't do this. Like, I'm not letting you do this in my parish. And then he basically had to write a book, the Malus Maleficarum, arguing that, we need to be doing this. And so, again, I think that's what's interesting about it is that even inside of Christianity, at least with the witch trials, they couldn't quite make their mind up about what they thought about this. That the Christianity was very torn about what to do. And areas, ironically enough, areas in which the Inquisition was very powerful, like Spain, the execution rates were very low or lower than they were in other areas. The Inquisition put the brakes on the witch trials more than it actually kicked them up, which is often people often find that strange, that the Inquisition was a barrier to the witch trials, because basically the Inquisition thought this was a bunch of yahoos killing people. it was for us to kill people. You got to leave that to the professionals.
Absolutely.
So they're like, yeah, if you're gonna burn heretics, you got to make sure you really got them. And so it's just an interesting. The history of that stuff is fascinating.
Yeah.
I find it endlessly fascinating.
Can you recommend any extra reading?
On alchemy or on?
Yeah, well, on Jewish alchemy.
So the absolute best book on Jewish alchemy is actually a book called The Jewish Alchemists by Raphael Patai. I'll put it in the chat so the folks can have it. It's basically the standard book. It's really, really great by a really great scholar.
That may have been where I got the my picture from on Facebook from the.
Could
I
have
just
been,
Googled Jewish alchemists and looked at images and grabbed one of them that looked good and used it. So
I think it's So I do the
that
same
may
thing.
well be from that book. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it very well could be. Yeah, but this is the Jewish Alchemist. What's really great about this book is that it's both a history and a reader. And so Patai goes in and translates. Speaking of people who have a lot of languages, he's translating things from Aramaic, from Greek, from Latin, from French, and the book is as much a reader as it is a history. So it's actually 2 in 1, which is really good. As an anthology, it's an anthology and a history at the same time, which is an excellent resource.
Brother Knox, did you have any questions? I've been quiet this whole time. Nope. Okay.
I'll ask him to unmute just in case he's muttering away.
Well, I know that Al doesn't have his mic isn't working, so he'd have to chat. He hasn't submitted anything. Okay. Al says great class. Okay. Thank you. Al contributed. Well, I do appreciate this, Justin. This was very interesting. There was a lot of information there. I'm going to go back and watch this. It will be posted on YouTube, and I'll make sure that I send you a link to it.
Yep.
When we have it posted, hopefully more people get a chance to see it. I had hoped to have more people to ask more questions, but there's a lot to unpack. I mean, as I was following along, I should have taken notes because I'm sure I'll see something later. It's like, oh yeah, what was that?
Yeah,
I'll
you can
just
always email
message
me
you later and get more info.
Yeah. And like I said, almost every one of these slides and almost everything I've talked about, if you go to my YouTube channel, I've done episodes on Maria the Jewess, on the Eish Metzaref. So it's one of these things that the YouTube channel is really going to be, it's a repository for a lot of this pretty esoteric knowledge. And so really trying to get this stuff out there and make it a lot more accessible for folks who, who want to dive into this. So
well, we appreciate it. So you did join. I know that you friended me. Did you join our Facebook group?
No, I'm not even on Facebook.
Oh, you're not. Oh, that's right. No, that's right.
Yeah, I'm not.
You.
Yeah, not even on. Yeah, I don't have Facebook or Twitter. I have just.
Okay.
Just YouTube. I hear how much time people sink into Twitter and other thing, and I'm like, I got a 2-year-old and a 7-month-old, and I run a YouTube channel. If I could convert lead into time, that's what I'd much rather have. More time. That's the only thing I'm good about gold anyways. It gives you more time. But yeah, so I don't have any other social media platforms. But yeah, just shoot me an email if you when you get.
I will do that. I will ask people if I get questions from people. If I think of anything, I'll be sure to ping on you about that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we may have you on here. Do you have another talk? Well, you talk on numerous things, so maybe at some point we'll bring you back.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
That would be
wonderful. Just look at the topics on YouTube. I cover a wide range of stuff. Again, from an academic perspective. So I think sometimes people who work in this kind of material can be a little off the deep end, or I'm not sure what the right word is. They can be
focused.
Or like maybe they've drank the Kool-Aid a little bit. I don't know, something like that. And so I don't think of myself as that. And so it's. The channel and the work I do is approaching these esoteric topics, but approaching them, from a completely academic, scholarly perspective. So, so I think it's ground in the history and ground in the science and in the ancient languages. So,
maybe I could do this because like I said, there's several references to Kabbalah. I'll try and learn to say it that way.
Yeah, just say it ever how it works for you. People sometimes say, "What's the correct pronunciation of this?" And I'm like, if you say it and I understand what you're saying,
yes,
you pronounced it correctly.
Right. I think the Kabbalah I think it's probably the most misunderstood. I love the way that you reference Madonna there. But it's one of the probably most misunderstood things in like American culture. Is like celebrities latch onto it and they talk about it. And everyone I've asked about it says, well, go and study this, and this for 10 years and come back. And then we'll say you'll be ready to study the Kabbalah. Like, okay, so I get that. You can't just walk in the door. There's not, maybe you should write a complete idiot guide to the Kabbalah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think there probably is one actually. I think there probably is one of those like idiot guide to Kabbalah. But it is like one of those things where, it is really deep and it does take a long time to really get a grasp on it. And it's the job of any educator to make stuff that's inaccessible accessible. And so anyone who tells me that something is so inaccessible that no one can possibly know it, my general guess at that point is they don't know it themselves. That's my typical assumption. Also the same with people who hide behind a lot of jargon and stuff. If they have to hide everything behind jargon, I'm like, you don't think you know what you're talking about. But yeah, Kabbalah, like intro Kabbalah, I do some of that stuff on the channel as well. And but yeah, intro Kabbalah, the basic ideas of Kabbalah are not terribly complicated, and I certainly could do.
Well, I was going to say, I work in IT. I'm a computer programmer by trade. So a large part of my job is taking stuff that's very technical and explaining it to a non-technical person. So I've gotten pretty good about that. It's like I can see the complex behind it all and say, okay, well, you're on a bus and Brian's on a bus and Brian wants to get off here. So I have to find a way to stop the bus to let Brian off, but you want to go into the next destination. So we have to keep going. And I have to convert it into something that less technical people can relate to. So I can kind of relate to what you say there. I get it on this level and I see it clearly, but I got to put it in a way to someone who doesn't have all my years of experience can pick it up and say, well, yes, by all means, you can put a line on the bus so you can stop the bus at any point. Yes, we'll approve that. And then I go make it work. But I was
what languages do you work in?
C# primarily.
Yeah, I grew up by learning C and then C++. I remember the glory days of. I remember when I first libraries. I was like, wow, I don't have to write a random number generator every time I want a random number generated.
Yes,
that was a breakthrough moment in my life.
I do primarily web-based stuff. I work mostly in SharePoint. I'm getting now into Azure, which is cloud-based programming. It's very interesting. It's wide open now. But I learned enough C and C++ to learn I didn't want to do it. And then when I found that when you got into Visual Basic and C#, you can just have an event. You don't have to do all the wiring up to get an event. And I saw in C++ how to make an event to then consume it. Whereas in .NET, it's just simply you say, use a click event. And then the library provides all the hard wiring to make the event happen. It's like, that's what I want. Here's a form, here's a button, double click on the button, and there's your click event, and it will work. And you just put your code in.
Like, it's so much more interactive.
I'll be fourth generation. That's fine.
Well, it's just also just that computers are fast and the processors are fast enough now that you don't have to write everything in machine code or whatever.
Right, to be efficient. Right.
Yeah, to be efficient. Things are so fast now that you don't have to do that, which is
so
great.
What I was thinking though is if I like I mentioned, there's several things I've seen, several references to stuff you brought up and maybe think of other things. If I can go through our rituals and the writings like Pike had on the degrees and stuff and pull out some things referencing the Kabbalah and maybe bring those to you and say, okay, can you explain more about this? Where I could then turn around and explain it in simple terms. Because we watch the degrees and people use these terms and we know the words that we've used, but if we don't really understand, all we know is, well, you've got like the tree of life. That's 3 circles around a center core, and there are all these different things. And that's kind of it. All we know is the ritual. So maybe that'd be kind of interesting to help you. You can help me translate it into something more accessible.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to
tie it directly to Masonic degrees. I think that would be really interesting to a lot of people. It's like, oh, okay, that's what it means.
Yeah, I mean, I can't, like I said, I not being a Mason, and so I can't. So it's one of those things where like, one of the things I do from an ethics perspective is I don't try to look up if they're initiatory societies. I do my best not to look up the stuff because I feel like it's not fair to the societies to do that. So it's one of those things where, whatever you're willing to share with me, I'll certainly tell you from the Jewish mysticism side what they mean in Jewish mysticism, how they are taken up into Freemasonry. Obviously you would know more about that than I would, and so I could be like, well, this is sort of where it lands on this side of it, and then maybe that would shed some more light on how they're taken up into Freemasonry more generally.
Oh, cool. It'll be very interesting. Okay, good. Well, good. Then you'll probably hear from me a lot. Then I'll come up with some interesting things. I'd like to have you as a source. That would be great. I think the more people I connect with on this stuff as I'm exploring, I'm trying to get below the surface myself. I'm trying to dig deeper into this stuff and get some interesting speakers here on this Zoom thing, because it's so popular now and so many people are interested in having something. Since we can't meet in person, more people want to go online. So I'm trying to find interesting topics on this weekly chat to get people in here and kind of, break new ground is what I'm trying to do and look into more stuff. So this is great. So I really appreciate it. If nobody else has any more questions, I'm going to go and wrap it up. We've gone a good 2 hours here, so I think we've done enough.
It was brilliant. Thank you.
Yes, I do appreciate Mr. Sledge. I really do, and look forward to speaking more in depth with you in the future on this stuff.
Absolutely. Well,
Okay.
thank you guys so much for having me, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
All right.
Thank you
Bye.
very much.
Bye bye.
Thanks a lot.